The town hall meeting was held in the old community center on Maple Street, a building that had seen better days but still held the heart of the town. Folding chairs were set up in uneven rows, some with duct tape holding the legs together. A few ceiling tiles were stained from last winter's leak, and the hum of the ancient HVAC system buzzed like a tired bee in the background. Still, the room was full. People had come early, not just out of civic duty, but because they'd heard Karoline Leavitt would be there in person. No teleprompter, no staged backdrop, just her and a microphone. She walked in through the side door, flanked by two aides who quickly set up a small table with bottled water and a stack of glossy flyers. Leavitt herself wore a navy blazer and sensible shoes, her hair pulled back neatly. She greeted people with a firm handshake and a warm smile, but there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she'd been running on coffee and 4 hours of sleep. This wasn't her first stop that week, and it wouldn't be her last. But tonight mattered. Veterans' issues were a key part of her campaign message, and this town had more than its share of former service members, some from Vietnam, others from Iraq and Afghanistan, a few even from the Gulf. As she took the podium, the room settled. A baby fussed in the back quickly hushed. An elderly man in a ball cap with faded gold lettering, USS Constellation, leaned forward in his seat, arms crossed. A woman in her 30s, wearing a mechanic's shirt with grease still under her nails, scrolled briefly on her phone before slipping it into her pocket and giving Leavitt her full attention. Leavitt began with gratitude. "Thank you for your service. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for caring about the future of this country." Her voice was clear, practiced, and confident. She spoke about expanding VA benefits, cutting red tape, and ensuring every veteran got the mental health support they deserved. She mentioned bipartisan efforts and long-term plans. It was the kind of speech that sounded good on paper and even better in a campaign ad. But in this room, filled with people who'd lived the reality behind those talking points, something felt off. Not wrong, just distant, like listening to someone describe rain without ever having gotten wet. Then, about 10 minutes in, a hand went up from the third row. It wasn't a bold, waving gesture, just a slow lift of the arm, fingers slightly curled like the person wasn't sure he should interrupt. He was older, maybe late 60s, with silver hair cut short and a face that looked like it had spent decades squinting into sun and wind. He wore a brown leather jacket over a plain gray shirt, no pins, no patches, nothing to announce who he was. But the way the people around him shifted, some nodding, others glancing at each other with knowing looks, told you he wasn't just another attendee. Leavitt paused mid-sentence. "Yes, sir," she said, pointing gently in his direction. He stood slowly, like his knees needed a moment to agree. He didn't take the mic someone offered. His voice was low but carried. "I served," he said simply. 22 months in country. Came home in 72. Didn't talk about it for 30 years. Still don't much." A quiet murmur passed through the room, not out of disrespect but recognition. This was one of theirs. Leavitt nodded. "Thank you for your service," she said, the phrase automatic but sincere. He gave a small shrug as if to say that thanks wouldn't fix what came next. "I appreciate what you're saying up there," he continued, "but it sounds like you're reading from a list of promises. And I've heard a lot of promises." He didn't say it with anger. There was no bitterness in his tone, just weariness, the kind that settles deep in your bones after years of being let down. "My best friend didn't make it back. He was 19. Last thing he did was write a letter to his little sister. Never got sent. Got caught in his pack when the medevac couldn't reach him in time." He paused, swallowed. "I kept that letter for 20 years before I could bring myself to mail it. And when I did, his sister had moved. No forwarding address. The room was utterly still now. Even the HVAC seemed to quiet down. I'm not asking for pity," he added quickly. "I'm just saying, when you talk about supporting veterans, it can't just be about budgets and bills. It's about seeing us. Really seeing us. Not as a voting bloc or a policy problem, but as people who carried things most folks can't imagine and still do." Leavitt opened her mouth to respond, her campaign-trained reflexes kicking in. She started to say something about the new mental health initiative she'd co-sponsored, about telehealth access and peer counseling programs. But before she could finish the sentence, the man raised a hand, not to stop her, but to gently redirect. "Ma'am," he said, "I didn't come here for your platform. I came here to see if you'd really hear me." That stopped her cold. She blinked. looked down at her notes, then back at him. For the first time all evening, she wasn't performing. She was just present. The polished candidate faded, and in her place stood a young woman facing a truth she hadn't prepared for. Around the room, people exchanged glances. Some leaned forward. Others sat back as if giving the moment space to breathe. No one checked their phone. No one whispered. Even the baby in the back had gone quiet. Because something real was happening. This wasn't politics anymore. It was human. And in that quiet, charged moment, everyone in the room, whether they'd served or not, felt it. The gap between words and wounds, between promises and pain, had just gotten a little narrower. Not because of a policy proposal, but because one man had the courage to speak, and one woman had the humility to listen. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the old windows. Inside, the air felt different, lighter somehow, even though the weight of what had just been said hung heavy. Leavitt took a breath, nodded slowly, and stepped away from the podium. She didn't have a perfect answer. And maybe for the first time that was okay. The room stayed quiet for a beat too long, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full. Full of unspoken memories, of questions no one had dared to ask out loud, of years spent swallowing pride just to get through another VA appointment or another sleepless night. The man in the leather jacket didn't sit right away. He stood there, hands resting lightly on the back of the chair in front of him, eyes fixed on Leavitt, not with challenge, but with something quieter, expectation maybe, or just plain honesty. Leavitt didn't rush to fill the silence with another rehearsed line. She let it sit, and in that pause something shifted. Not dramatically. No music swelled, no lights changed, but the energy in the room softened, like a door had cracked open just enough to let in some fresh air. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped down from the small platform, walked around the podium, and moved slowly down the center aisle. Her heels clicked softly against the worn linoleum floor. People turned in their seats to watch her go, some with curiosity, others with cautious hope. She stopped a few feet from the man and turned to face him, no longer a candidate addressing a crowd, but one person speaking to another. "I don't know what it's like," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of the campaign cadence. "I've never worn a uniform. I've never been in a foxhole or lost someone in my arms or come home to a country that didn't know what to do with me. I can read reports, quote statistics, even draft legislation, but none of that tells me what it really feels like to carry that weight." A few people nodded. An older woman near the front wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. The man looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod of his own. "That's fair," he said. "But knowing you don't know, that's where it starts." He finally sat, and Leavitt pulled over an empty chair from the row behind her. She didn't sit beside him, not yet, just close enough that they weren't separated by stage and audience anymore. She turned to face the room again, but this time her posture was different. Less performance, more presence. "I came here tonight thinking I'd explain my plan," she admitted, "but maybe what I should have done first was listen. So tell me, what do you need that no one's giving you?" That opened the floodgates, not in a chaotic way, but like a slow, steady current finally finding its path. A woman in fatigues raised her hand. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and now worked nights at a warehouse because the VA therapist she'd been assigned hadn't returned her calls in 3 weeks. A younger man, barely 30, spoke about how hard it was to find housing after leaving the service. Landlords saw veteran and assumed PTSD meant instability, not discipline or reliability. Another veteran, this one missing part of his left ear, talked about how paperwork errors delayed his disability check for months, forcing him to choose between his medication and his electric bill. Leavitt didn't interrupt. She didn't take notes. She just listened, her expression shifting from concern to sorrow to resolve. And when it was quiet again, the man in the leather jacket spoke once more. But this time it wasn't about policy or systems. It was personal. "I waited 11 months for a prosthetic leg," he said, voice calm but edged with something sharp underneath. 11 months of infections, of pain, of begging clerks who kept saying, "Your file's in processing." Turns out they'd lost it. Twice. When I finally got the leg, it didn't fit right. Took another 6 months to get it adjusted. By then I'd learned to live with the pain. Easier than fighting a machine that doesn't see you as a person. He looked around the room. "We're not asking for handouts. We're asking to be treated like we matter. Like our time, our sacrifice, our lives meant something. Leavitt swallowed hard. They should have done better, she said. And I should have known better than to talk about fixing the system without first understanding how broken it feels from the inside. Then she turned fully to him. What's your name, sir? He hesitated, as if name still carried weight he wasn't sure he wanted to share. Frank, he said finally. Frank, she repeated, like she was committing it to memory. Thank you for trusting me with that. He gave a small shrug. I'm not trusting you yet. I'm giving you a chance to earn it. That honesty hung in the air, raw and real. No spin, no sugarcoating. Just two people, one carrying decades of unspoken grief, the other carrying the weight of public expectation. And for the first time, they were meeting somewhere in the middle. Someone in the back cleared their throat. So what now? They asked. Do we just go home and hope the next politician listens? Leavitt looked at Frank, then at the room. No, she said. What happens now is I stop talking and start doing. Not with press releases, but with you. If you're willing, I'd like to meet with a small group after this. Just veterans, no cameras, no staff. Tell me what needs to change and I'll take it back with me word for word. A few people exchanged glances, skeptical but not closed off. Frank studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. All right, he said. But only if you promise one thing. Anything, she said. Don't turn our stories into sound bites. She met his gaze without flinching. I won't. And in that moment, something fragile but real began to form. Not an alliance, not a promise of victory, but a thread of trust, thin but strong enough to hold. Outside, the wind had died down. Inside, the room felt warmer, not because of the heater, but because something human had taken root. People started talking to each other, not about politics, but about shared experiences, about who knew whom, about which VA office was least likely to lose your file. Leavitt stayed in her chair, listening more than speaking, asking questions instead of giving answers. And Frank? He didn't leave. He stayed right where he was, watching, waiting, not with suspicion anymore, but with something that looked a lot like hope. Quiet, cautious, and hard-won, but hope all the same. The room had settled into a different kind of quiet now. Not the heavy silence that follows grief, but the calm that comes after truth has been spoken and heard. People shifted in their seats, some leaning toward each other in low conversation, others just sitting with their thoughts, letting the weight of what had been shared sink in. Leavitt remained in the folding chair she'd pulled into the aisle, no longer the polished candidate from the opening remarks, but someone who looked like she'd just walked through something real and wasn't quite sure how to carry it yet. Frank hadn't moved much either. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, eyes down for a moment as if gathering himself. Then he looked up, not at the crowd, not at the walls, but straight at Leavitt. There was something in his expression that made the air tighten again, just slightly. Not anger, not sadness, something deeper, something private. He stood slowly the way he had before, like his body needed time to catch up with his mind. This time, though, he didn't raise his hand or wait to be acknowledged. He just walked toward her, step by careful step, until he was close enough that only she could hear what he was about to say. The room noticed. Conversations tapered off, shoulders straightened. Everyone sensed it. The moment had turned again, and whatever was coming next wasn't meant for an audience, even though they were all watching. Leavitt rose to her feet as he approached, not out of formality, but out of respect. She didn't speak. She just waited. Frank stopped a foot away. He glanced around, not nervously, but deliberately, as if making sure no cameras were rolling, no phones pointed their way. Then he leaned in just slightly and spoke in a voice so low it barely carried beyond her. What he said lasted only a few seconds. 2 sentences. That was all, but the effect was immediate. Leavitt's breath caught. Her eyes widened, then softened in the same instant like a dam had broken behind them. She brought one hand to her mouth, not in shock, but in something closer to sorrow, deep personal sorrow. Her shoulders dropped, as if the weight of those words had settled right onto her bones. And then she did something no one expected. She reached out and gently placed a hand on Frank's forearm. Not a politician's pat, not a stage gesture, but a human touch, steady and quiet. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I had no idea." That was all she said. But it was enough. Because someone near the front, maybe the woman in the mechanic's shirt, maybe the veteran with the missing ear, must have caught the tail end of what Frank said, or read it in Leavitt's face because a soft gasp escaped them. Then another, and another, like ripples moving outward from a single stone dropped in still water. Within seconds, the whole room seemed to exhale in stunned disbelief. No one shouted. No one stood up. But the energy shifted completely. The air felt charged, not with drama, but with empathy. People looked at Frank not with pity, but with a new kind of understanding. And they looked at Leavitt differently too, not as a candidate anymore, but as someone who had just been handed something sacred and didn't try to hide from it. Later, people would piece together what had been said, not from a leaked recording, there wasn't one, but from the way Leavitt carried herself afterward, from the way Frank's voice cracked the next time he spoke, from the quiet conversations that followed in parking lots and coffee shops. He had told her, "My son voted for you last election. He believed in you. He died overseas last month. And I just needed to know. Did you mean what you said back then?" That was it. No accusation, no blame. Just a father's raw, aching question, wrapped in grief, wrapped in hope, wrapped in the desperate need to believe that his son's faith in someone hadn't been misplaced. Leavitt didn't answer right away. She just stood there with him, hand still on his arm, eyes glistening but dry. She didn't offer empty comfort or pivot to a promise. She simply held the space for his pain and in doing so honored it. After a long moment, she nodded. "Every word," she said softly. "I meant every word." Frank studied her face, searching for any trace of performance, any flicker of insincerity. He found none, and something in him seemed to loosen just a little. He gave a small nod, then stepped back, returning to his seat without another word. But the room would never be the same. People began to murmur, not loudly, but with a new kind of urgency. A veteran near the back wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. The woman who'd asked, "So what now?" earlier now sat very still, staring at the floor, processing. Even the baby, who'd been fussy at the start of the night, was quiet in its mother's arms, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Leavitt returned to her chair, but she didn't resume her speech. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, not through policy points or campaign slogans, but through a single, human exchange that cut through all the noise. "I don't have the right words," she finally said to the room, her voice steadier now but still thick with emotion. "But I have a responsibility, and I won't forget what was shared here tonight." No one clapped. No one cheered. But there was a quiet nodding, a collective acknowledgement that something real had happened. Something that couldn't be scripted, couldn't be spun, and wouldn't be forgotten. As the meeting wound down, people didn't rush for the exits. They lingered. Some approached Frank, not to offer condolences because that would have been too much, but just to stand near him, to let him know he wasn't alone. Others spoke quietly with Leavitt, not about votes or platforms, but about their own losses, their own hopes. Outside, the night air was cool and clear. Stars blinked overhead, indifferent to the human drama below. But inside that aging community center, something rare had taken place. Two people from completely different worlds had met in the raw, unguarded space between grief and grace, and in doing so, reminded everyone watching that politics at its best isn't about power, it's about people. And sometimes the most powerful moments happen not on a stage, but in the quiet space between two chairs when one person dares to ask, and another dares to answer with their whole heart. The next morning, no one expected the story to spread. It wasn't supposed to go beyond the walls of that old community center. There were no press vans parked outside, no campaign photographers snapping stage shots. Just a room full of ordinary people who'd witnessed something real, and most of them were too stunned or too respectful to turn it into content right away. But someone had recorded it. Not the whole thing, just the last few minutes. A woman in the second row sitting beside her teenage daughter had pulled out her phone when she saw Leavitt step down from the podium. She hadn't planned to post it. She just wanted to remember how it felt. The quiet courage in Frank's voice, the way Leavitt's face changed when she heard what he whispered. Later that night, still thinking about it, she uploaded the clip to a local community group online with a simple caption. "This happened at the town hall last night. Thought you should see." Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times. By morning, it was everywhere. Not because it was dramatic or sensational, but because it was honest. In a world full of polished speeches and rehearsed outrage, this was raw, unfiltered humanity. People watched it on their lunch breaks, in bed before sleep, on bus rides home. They didn't comment much. They just shared it, often with no words at all. Just the video and a heart emoji or "this got me." Local news picked it up first. A reporter who'd been covering the campaign heard about the clip from a friend and drove to the town to talk to people who were there. They interviewed the woman in the mechanic's shirt, the veteran with the missing ear, even the volunteer who'd set up the chairs. No one exaggerated. No one spun it. They just told what happened in their own words, with the kind of quiet reverence usually reserved for funerals or weddings. Then national outlets noticed. Not the flashy cable shows, but the ones that still cared about ground-level stories. A morning news segment played the clip during a quiet moment between weather and traffic. A respected newspaper ran a short piece titled, "When Politics Stopped and People Began." Veterans groups reposted it with messages like, "This is what we've been asking for," or "Finally, someone listened." But the most powerful reactions came from other veterans. Messages poured into local VA offices, not with complaints, but with stories, some about their own children who'd served, others about friends they'd lost, many just saying, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." One retired Marine wrote a letter to the editor that ended with, "I've stopped believing politicians hear us. Last night, for the first time in years, I felt heard." Leavitt's team was overwhelmed. Her social media manager showed her the analytics, views climbing into the millions, shares from people who'd never engaged with politics before. But Leavitt didn't celebrate. She didn't post a follow-up video or draft a press release capitalizing on the moment. Instead, she called Frank, not through an aide, not with a scheduled courtesy call. She looked up his number from the sign-in sheet at the town hall and dialed it herself early the next morning. He answered on the third ring. They talked for 20 minutes. She didn't offer solutions. She didn't ask for his endorsement. She just asked how he was doing, if he'd slept, if there was anything he needed. Not as a candidate, but as someone who now carried a piece of his grief with her. Frank didn't say much. But he listened. And when she asked if she could visit, not for photos, not for the campaign, just to sit with him, he said yes. She came 2 days later, on a gray Saturday morning. No staff, no cameras, just her, a thermos of coffee and a handwritten note she'd stayed up late writing. She knocked on his door in a quiet neighborhood where the lawns were neat but not fancy, where American flags hung from porches not as symbols, but as quiet remembrances. Frank opened the door in the same leather jacket, though this time it was zipped against the chill. He didn't smile, but he didn't close the door either. He stepped aside and let her in. Inside, the house was simple. Wood floors, a well-worn couch, family photos on the wall. One picture stood out, a young man in uniform smiling like he had the whole world ahead of him. Leavitt didn't ask. She just nodded toward it. "That's him," Frank said quietly. She didn't say, "I'm sorry" again. She just stood there with him for a moment, letting the silence hold what words couldn't. They sat at his kitchen table. He made tea. She told him about her grandfather, who'd served in Korea and never talked about it until the last year of his life. Frank listened. Then he told her about his son, not just how he died, but who he was, how he loved fixing old motorcycles, how he'd argued with his little sister about music, how he'd voted for the first time just months before deployment because he believed in giving a voice to the voiceless. Leavitt took it all in, not as research, not as material, just as a human being bearing witness. Before she left, she asked if she could meet with his son's unit, those who'd served alongside him, who'd come home. Frank thought about it, then nodded. "They're good people," he said. "They carry it too." That meeting happened a week later in a VFW hall an hour away. 10 men and women showed up. No media, no agenda. Just a circle of chairs and a promise from Leavitt. "Tell me what you need. I'll listen and I'll act." What they shared wasn't about policy, it was about dignity. About being remembered not just as soldiers, but as people. About wanting their fallen friends to be more than names on a memorial. One woman said, "We don't need you to fix everything. We just need you to see us." Leavitt left that meeting with pages of notes, but more importantly with a changed understanding. She scrapped her original veterans platform and started over, this time with input from those who'd lived it. She formed an advisory group made entirely of enlisted veterans. No generals, no lobbyists, just people who'd worn the boots and carried the weight. And through it all, Frank didn't speak to the press. He didn't appear at rallies, but he started showing up. At town halls, at community forums, always in the back, always quiet. People noticed. They'd nod when he walked in. Some would save him a seat. The viral moment never turned into a campaign gimmick. It stayed what it was, a human exchange that reminded everyone, voters, politicians, even the skeptics, that beneath the noise of politics, there are real people with real stories waiting to be heard. And sometimes all it takes is one honest question, and one honest answer to change everything. Months passed and the town hall meeting faded from the headlines, but not from memory. People still talked about it in diners over coffee, in garage workshops between wrench turns, and late-night texts between old friends who'd served together. It wasn't remembered as a political moment, but as a human one, the kind that sticks with you not because of what was said, but because of how it made you feel, seen maybe, or less alone. Leavitt's campaign changed after that night, not in flashy ways, but in quiet, steady shifts. She stopped leading with talking points and started with questions. At every stop, she'd ask veterans to speak first. She'd sit in the audience while they talked, taking notes by hand, sometimes just listening without writing anything down at all. Her policy proposals grew more specific, more grounded, not because consultants rewrote them, but because real people had shaped them over kitchen tables and VFW hall meetings. Frank didn't become a campaign surrogate. He never stood on stage beside her or gave interviews praising her integrity. But he kept showing up. Not at every event, just enough to let people know he was still watching, still paying attention. He'd sit near the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But if Leavitt said something that rang true, he'd give a small nod. And if she slipped into old habits, repeating a phrase that sounded too polished, too rehearsed, he'd stand up quietly and leave. She noticed, and each time she'd adjust. The real test came during a televised debate late in the season. The moderator, sharp-eyed and seasoned, asked her directly, "Your stance on veterans' care has evolved significantly over the past year. What changed your mind?" The easy answer would have been to cite new data, a policy paper or a meeting with experts. But Leavitt didn't go there. She paused, looked straight into the camera and said, "I used to think leadership was about having answers. Now I know it's about having the humility to be changed by someone's truth." She didn't name Frank. She didn't replay the viral moment. But anyone who'd been in that room or who'd watched the clip knew exactly what she meant. The audience in the debate hall didn't applaud. They just sat very still, as if honoring the weight of what she'd admitted, that she'd been wrong before, and that being wrong had led her somewhere better. After the debate, a veteran who'd served in Iraq sent her a message. "You didn't just talk about us tonight. You spoke like one of us was in the room with you." She saved that note. She kept it in her wallet. Election day came and went. The results weren't what some had hoped for, and weren't what others had feared. Leavitt didn't win by a landslide. She didn't lose in a landslide either. She won by a margin narrow enough to remind everyone that democracy is rarely about sweeping victories, but about showing up, listening, and earning trust one conversation at a time. On the morning after, before the victory speeches and the press calls, she drove to Frank's house again. Same thermos of coffee, same quiet knock on the door. He opened it without surprise, as if he'd been expecting her. This time he offered a faint smile, small but real. They sat on his porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft oranges and pinks. No agenda, no cameras. Just two people who'd been through something together, even if they'd started from opposite sides of a room. "I didn't come to thank you," she said after a while. "I came to tell you I won't forget." Frank nodded slowly, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. "Most people don't forget the easy parts," he said. "They forget the hard ones, the waiting, the silence, the days when no one asks how you're really doing." "I won't," she promised. He looked at her then, really looked at her like he was deciding whether to believe her. After a long moment, he said, "My son used to say that change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from people choosing every day to do better than yesterday." She didn't respond right away. She just let those words settle between them, like stones dropped in still water. Later that week, Leavitt held her first official meeting as the newly elected representative. But instead of gathering in a government office, she rented the same community center on Maple Street. She invited the same people, the mechanic, the retired sailor, the young veteran who'd struggled to find housing. And she invited Frank. He came, sat in the third row again, same leather jacket, same quiet presence. This time, she didn't start with a speech. She started by reading aloud the names of every local service member who'd died in the past decade, including Frank's son. She didn't rush through them. She said each name slowly, clearly, like it mattered, because it did. Afterward, she announced the formation of a new local Veterans Council, not appointed by her but chosen by the community. Its first task? Review every piece of proposed legislation affecting veterans before it reached her desk. Their word would carry real weight. People left that meeting not with flyers or promises, but with a sense that something had shifted, not just in policy, but in posture. The distance between those who serve and those who govern had narrowed, not because of a law, but because two people had dared to be honest with each other in a crowded room. Frank didn't become a public figure. He never gave interviews or wrote op-eds, but he started volunteering at the VA Outreach Center once a week, helping other veterans navigate the maze of paperwork and appointments. Sometimes he'd mention Leavitt, not as a politician, but as someone who'd listened when it mattered, and Leavitt? She kept visiting. Not for photo ops, but because she'd learned that leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about staying connected to the people those decisions affect. She'd sit with Frank on his porch sometimes, not talking much, just sharing the quiet. And in those moments, neither of them was a veteran or a representative. They were just two people who'd found common ground in grief, honesty, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust. The story didn't end with a grand victory or a tidy resolution. Real life rarely does. But it ended with something quieter and maybe more lasting, the understanding that change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and if you're willing to lean in and listen, really listen, it can change you too.